Welcome to this reading. This is Professor Smith, and I will be recording the book After Polygamy Was Made a Sin, The Social History of Christian Polygamy by John Cairncross. Polygamy was forbidden after Roman papists took over the church. Isaiah 4 tells us the Astra strongholds denying every believing woman a good husband will be overcome at the last. Enjoy, and may the Almighty Yahweh bless you. After Polygamy Was Made a Sin, The Social History of Christian Polygamy by John Cairncross. This will be some introductory materials. This is Professor Smith, the reader for this program. And as I go through, I may be commenting here and there. I will usually preface that by saying a reader's note. Some further introductory materials, and then we get to some quotes from either writers or poets throughout the ages. Dryden wrote a piece called Absalom and Achitophel, and it has a line in there, and the line is, I quote, "In pious times, ere priestcraft did begin, before polygamy was made a sin." One of the famous quotes from his pieces, and it really seems to underscore an essential truth that we're going to delve into in this book. This is from Monsieur de Pourcemac. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correct. It's a long French name. Anyway, it is translated into English, and it says, for polygamy is a hanging matter. Let me read that again. For polygamy is a hanging matter. Okay, and then A.H. Clow and the latest Decalogue. His position was, you shall have one wife only, who would be at the expense of keeping two. Then there's a limerick here, and it quotes as follows. There was a young fellow of Lyme who married 3 wives at a time. One asked, why the third? He replied, one's absurd, and bigamy, sir, is a crime. Kind of an interesting limerick there, isn't it? This is from Helen Mar Whitney, who happened to be a Mormon lady, and I quote, and down with wayward Rome's economy, parent of countless ills, monogamy. Interesting. That's kind of a social commentary on the economics differences between two systems, that being serial monogamy versus polygamy. Some other table of comments here, table of contents. Let's see if I can get my words right. We're now at preface. Okay, so we're going to get into this material. Preface. The idea of writing this book goes back to the winter's day on the Paris quays, some 20 years ago, when I discovered a rare French 18th century book. It was a defense of monogamy, and it turned out to be dull and prolix. However, a second reading revealed that the work was not just a conventional moral treatise, but was an attempt to counter a very real campaign in favor of polygamy. I tracked down the equally rare studies referred to by the author. My appetite was whetted. I began to dig deeper into this new and bizarre controversy. One discovery led to another. A lucky find in a London bookshop showed that Milton had secretly held pro-polygamy views. Another buy, also in London, brought to light the indignant attack of B. Higgins, gentleman, on Bishop Burnet's heterodox opinions on matrimony. A month's intensive research at the British Museum and a delightful professorial year at Western Reserve University in Cleveland brought in a rich harvest, especially of German and American material. From all this detective work, there emerged a long but largely underground tradition of Christian polygamy, supplemented and sometimes intertwined with a mainly French free-thinking current, which extends from the first half of the 16th century to about 1800. and indeed in isolated areas of Utah to the present day. The reconstruction of the tradition was no easy task, precisely because it was underground. Orthodox in Western Europe, or for that matter, in the Christian world as a whole, have been fiercely opposed to polygamy in any shape or form since at least AD 600. Reader's note, that's an interesting year, isn't it? That's the year I think that you'll find as we go along that one of the Christian Roman head guys might have been Justinian. I'm just guessing here, but we'll see. And has shown itself particularly ruthless in suppressing the hated monster whenever it raised its head in their own ranks. This constant opposition explains both why the Christian polygamists rarely put their views into practice and why their writings are often to be found in scarce or out-of-the-way editions. For the same reason, most of the studies of the subject are fragmentary, uncritical, and biased. By going back to the original text, I have tried to present a less distorted picture of their tradition. The exposition of the material and its historical sequence and perspective has led to not a few curious discoveries, such as the relation between Mormon polygamy in its early stages and the private life of the founder of that religion. This book does not, of course, set out to argue the advantages of polygamy, of which there are as many kinds as there are of revolution. In particular, Christian polygamy, as I have attempted to show in chapter 1, is very much sui generis. That's an interesting French word, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correct, so you have to forgive me. Continuing on. It is therefore pointless in this book and elsewhere to talk of polygamy as such. While I discuss the possible reasons for the emergence of the tradition and its eclipse, my main aim is simply to portray each of the phases of its revolution or evolution, each of the phases of its evolution, which are often not causally connected, but arise from the combination of certain constant ingredients at various points in time between the years 1530 and to 1900. Despite the lengthy research and analysis which went to the making of this book, I greatly enjoyed writing it and only hope that it will divert the reader. Okay, so now we are at chapter 1, The Lordly Freedom of Man. On the 21st of July in the year of grace, 1534, the northwest German city of Munster proclaimed polygamy as the ideal form of marriage. The event is unique in the history of Christian Europe, and the reaction of this announcement explains why the experiment was never repeated, for it was greeted with unanimous revulsion and horror. This condemnation, both then and subsequently, reflects a loathing for polygamy, which is very deeply rooted in Western man. True, the idea of cohabiting both with a wife and one or more mistresses has often been tolerated and even covertly admired. But the open and legal possession of several wives permitted by polygamy has been strictly taboo. For most Europeans, such a practice has always seemed the acme of libertinage and has exercised a guilty fascination. It conjured up visions of voluptuous oriental harems and uninhibited caresses on sunny South Sea beaches. As Buffon points out in his comprehensive work on marriage, The Mothers, there is scarcely a feature of non-European societies which excites the same zealous denunciation. Among other departure from European sexual codes, even vice is looked upon with lenience in comparison. Almost from the outset, Christianity has set its face sternly against plural marriage. In fact, if polygamy was made a sin, this was the church's doing. To quote Buffon again, before the coming of Christ, polygamy was universally established and practiced. The terms monogamy, bigamy, polygamy, in the sense in which we use them, were unknown, and there existed no words to indicate what they denote. The prohibition of polygamy is not a natural, innate inclination of humanity, but was promulgated for the first time in any part of the world in the Code of Justinian in the 6th century of our era. Reader's note, yes, I was correct. Justinian was the one who really laid down the law against it. But then you have to consider for 600 years, It slipped by. It slipped by. Now think of the implications of that. I mean, if you are a listener out there, and it took them 600 years to make the first ban on the practice. Well, even among the Jews, it only took them to 1,000 years. And remember that the Jews accepted the Torah, and it came to around 1,000 after the coming of Messiah, Yeshua, to knuckle under the Catholic authorities and forbid the practice with some kind of Rabbi Gershom ban, which I must say is still in a de facto force in the nation of Israel today, even though the ban has long expired. Fascinating to consider. Continuing on. No authenticated instance is known outside Christian nations of a people among whom polygamy is an object of moral reprobation or is condemned or forbidden by tribal custom. Conversely, even today, the grounds of European objections to polygamy are incomprehensible to uncultured peoples. Reader's note, notice that the slander of other nations, perhaps mostly Muslim nations, is what he's referring to. Maybe in India, the Hindu nations, maybe these other cultures around the world, they have no such um, issue or problem with the practice because it stems from the natural inclination, the development of societies as such, and it was only really the cracking down of the Catholic masters and the infiltration of our master's church, getting even civil leaders to go along with them to forbid the practice. And this is essentially the truth I think we're going to explore as we continue on. How was it possible for such an unchristian institution to emerge in the heart of Europe? The answer is not a simple one, but it is undoubtedly connected with the outbreak of the Protestant Reformation in Germany, when the great reformer Martin Luther nailed his protest against papal indulgences to the church door in Wittenberg in 1517. He started an earthquake. The authority of the Pope and the Catholic hierarchy in northern Germany was rapidly undermined, and in a place was set the gospel, now available in the vernacular to all and sundry, and no longer a Latin text reserved for priests and scholars. Moreover, both the Old and New Testaments were held to be literally inspired, and hence equally deserving of reverence. Admittedly, in the Catholic Middle Ages, the patriarchs had been treated as the forerunners of Christ, but the Lutherans, placed them on an even higher pedestal. Hence, the polygamous proclivities of the Old Testament fathers began to loom larger and larger in theological discussions, and they were viewed with considerable indulgence. If Luther rejected pleas for the reintroduction of polygamy, this was not because he thought such a move would be morally wrong, but because he was convinced that it was not at all expedient, since it would be bound to discourage potential converts to the new faith. Reader's note, I think what he's saying there is that Luther was on a real unshaky foundation in a lot of ways because the powers of the papacy were great, enormous, and centuries long established in Europe. And this was a new movement, a fledgling movement, in fact, this Protestant Reformation, which Luther kicked off, not because he even thought it would happen. He was simply trying to protest. He had no idea that this was set in effect a domino, a revolution of sorts. But rather, Luther wanted to sort of keep the lid upon the boiling cauldron, lest it spill over and create such a mess that perhaps the Protestant Reformation would be blunted. And so the issue of polygamy was one such very visceral issue that went into Luther's calculus. Continuing on. But these discussions were merely one stream in the flood of controversy unleashed by Luther's defiance of clerical authority. Far more important than the validity of the patriarchal example was the denunciation of monastic celibacy as the root of all sexual evil. Reacting violently against medieval practice, he urged all but those with a genuine vocation for chastity to marry and propagate the species, especially women. For the first time in Europe, the text Increase and multiply resounded with predictable regularity from the pulpit. These doctrines were enthusiastically taken up by the more radical Protestant sects, especially the Anabaptists, and the men who proclaimed polygamy in Munster were of that persuasion. Among many other things, the sect was fiercely exclusive. Members regarded themselves as the elect, and everyone else, including Lutherans, as infidels. No marriage was valid unless contracted between sectarians and blessed by the elders. Such an attitude was bound to lead to some degree of contempt for orthodox morals, and some relaxation of the marriage bond. A marriage within the community might be held to be indissoluble, but this was a small comfort to the unbelieving spouse who, having refused to follow his or her partner in joining the elect, was summarily abandoned. The factor which probably had an even greater influence on Anabaptist morals, especially in Munster, was the belief of the sectarians in the second coming of Christ, who would restore all things to their pristine purity before the fall. Millennialism is as old as the world and has assumed innumerable forms. It has always, however, been the religion of the poor and the afflicted, who look to an apocalyptic future to compensate them for their present sufferings. The Anabaptists were drawn from the poorer classes. They were also excessively puritanical in their sexual morals. These various elements combined to produce the conviction that the begetting without sin or lust of a certain number of children would hasten the coming of Christ. Such a conception of marriage and parenthood clearly represented a potential move towards polygamy. Add to this the new emphasis on the Old Testament, Luther's teaching on marriage, the state of flux of religious belief in general, and in particular the domination of the sectarians by prophets receiving direct revelation from God. It will then be clear why theories which would ordinarily be dismissed as visionary could, given the right combination of circumstances, personality, and leadership, produced a kind of theological mutation, which was totally unexpected at the time. Cases of plural marriage can be traced spasmodically in central Germany during the 1520s, but the Anabaptists as a whole did not subscribe to polygamy. That institution was formally adopted by a group only when the Anabaptists took control of Munster, and even then, only after John of Leyden had assumed power, after the death of the previous leader, Jan Matthys. Most writers believe that John made his proclamation spurred on by unbridled sensuality, and more specifically, because although married to a sectarian girl, he was in love with Devara, Matthys' wife. He was also accused of having an intrigue with Devara while her husband was still alive. This interpretation is at best partial and superficial, for under torture, John stuck to the same story. He had never been involved with Devara before her husband was slain in battle. He had only gone to console her on her bereavement. After all, she was from Holland like him. What more natural than that he should console with her? He had married her afterwards, but in obedience to a solemn revelation from God. That had been vouchsafed to him a week before Jan died. In the vision, he had heard the voice of the Lord command him, "Thou shalt take Devara to wife." But no orders from on high were needed for John to fall in love with her. She was a queen of women, of medium height and on the plump side. She had a superb bearing, a perfect pink and white complexion and sparkling eyes. She had an irresistible charm, and she was 20. John himself needed no prompting. He was in the fullness of his vigor, only 5 years her elder. He had every gift needed for seduction, handsome, eloquent, a natural actor. He knew that Devara was his for the asking, but there was a complication. He was married, and divorce from a fellow sectarian was unthinkable. No wonder the vision had astonished and terrified him, for it meant that he was ordered by God to alter, not his feelings, but the institution of marriage itself, which he proceeded to do. Yet John Brocklesom's early record gave no hint that he would leave his mark on history and number among his achievements the legalization of polygamy. His origins were modest. He was the illegitimate son of the mayor of a small Dutch town near Leyden and of a serf, although his parents regularized their position soon after his birth. He was trained as a tailor. His enterprising and restless disposition sent him off round Europe as a traveling journeyman. He is known to have spent 4 years in England. He tried his hand at various business ventures, but they were, without exception, failures. His talents lay elsewhere. He was passionately addicted to poetry, and he wrote and acted in plays. However, his most memorable and dramatic successes were to be on the vast and turbulent stage of real life. It was his conversion that lifted him out of obscurity. He had had a weakness for wine and women, but toward the end of 1533 he saw the light and adopted the radical creed of the Anabaptists, which were sweeping across Holland and large areas of Western Europe. John Metis, the tall, black-bearded leader of the sect in Holland, and Devara's husband, adopted Brockelson as one of his chief lieutenants and dispatched him to Munster, a city where the gospel was falling on fertile soil. In 1533, the Lutheran community had already expelled the Catholic bishop who had hitherto ruled it. By February of the following year, 1534, the sectarians had gained power and were turning Munster into the first and, as it proved, the only Anabaptist citadel in the world. Matthijs was set for to take command. He was at once strengthened the believers' hold on the town by urging sympathizers to take refuge there from persecution, and underscored his appeal by promises of food, clothing, and money, and a dire prediction that by Easter all the rest of the world would be destroyed. Munster alone would survive and become the new Jerusalem. In making this prophecy, Jan was clearly influenced by his master Hoffman, who foretold a series of messianic wars and many signs and wonders which would come to pass in 1533, the 15th centenary, it was believed, of the death of Christ. But to merit surpassing grace, the city had to be purified of all uncleanness. Jan therefore decreed that all infidels, that is, Catholics and Lutherans, were to be put to the sword. It was only under the heaviest pressure from his associates that he agreed to a moderate solution, whereby the godless, including all men, children, invalids, and pregnant women, were driven out. In the midst of a raging snowstorm and stripped of all they possessed, even their food was taken from them. Reader's note. It seems to me that these people, though they were correct on the one point, had done so many criminal acts and things that were unconscionable that this, of course, brought about the wrath of Almighty Yahweh. And he used the Catholics and the Lutherans united together, perhaps for the first time, to completely destroy the city and the area round about. They certainly had done enough to create enough of a sore thumb in the act of taking multiple wives among the men. And this is why, this is just my commentary, I suppose, that those who are practicing this principle need to be very, very careful. We need to be very, very circumspect. I think the greatest priority we should hold is that we take great care not to allow dirty laundry to air before unbelievers, not to allow, in other words, we need to be highly self-regulatory. And of course, and this is in particular is women, and the whole idea of perhaps a woman getting to such a discontented area that, a feeling that she might go out and slander everyone. Well, this has a negative impact. And sometimes it can't be avoided. But I mean, when you look at the crimes that are being spoken of here, they're monstrous in many respects. Uh, and so I think we need to lead by love, and the kinds of things that were happening in Munster. Clearly, they brought judgment upon themselves. Continuing on. All non-Anabaptists who remained were rebaptized in the marketplace. From then on, the town was inhabited solely by the children of God, and the way was clear for the creation of a theocratic state ruled by the prophet of the Lord. A social and economic revolution was unleashed. The old culture was rejected, root and branch, and all books other than the Bible were burned. These excesses roused alarm in every court throughout Germany and far beyond. The powers that be lived in terror of the Anabaptists, even when far less bellicose even when far less bellicose than the Munsterites, and did everything to suppress their subversive ideas by savagely hunting down the believers, torturing them, and slaughtering them by fire, water, the sword, and the wheel. The new Republic of the Saints was a nightmare for the petty princes of what is now Germany. If it were allowed to continue undisturbed, it might well spread its influence and bring down the established order in ruins. In a country torn between Lutherans and Catholics and divided into 100 pocket states, Munster could create a pole of attraction for forces set in motion by Luther's crusade against the old religion and the smoldering popular discontent which had already erupted in the peasants' revolt of the 20s and had been ruthlessly suppressed with Luther's enthusiastic approval. Catholics and Lutherans therefore sank their fratricide hate and joined forces, albeit rather tepidly, to lay siege to the rebel city. To start with, the campaign went well. Mettes was killed on Easter Day, the 4th of April, as he sallied forth against the enemy with 20 psalm-singing comrades and an utter disregard for danger. Had he not been assured in a revelation that God in his might would annihilate the infidels, he was promptly cut to pieces, and the rebels' morale sank sharply. But John was equal to the occasion. He too had had a vision. He had foreseen his leader's death, which he assured his listeners was the will of God. He himself had been ordered to take over. From that moment on, John of Leyden was to be the undisputed commander of the Munsterites and to rule them with inflexible authority. He was a born leader with a fine presence and a fiery temperament, an irresistible orator. He reinforced his hold on his audience by his ability to conjure up on every occasion the appropriate Bible text. But he was much more than a rabble-rouser. He was one of those charismatic figures who, by their ruthlessness, organizational drive, and clarity of purpose, rise effortlessly to the top in times of transition and stress. His military strategy, except for the later stages of his rule, was outstanding and excelled in the art of political warfare. He played skillfully on the fact that most of the besieging forces were drawn from the same social strata as the majority of the Anabaptists, and hence were always ready to sympathize with the besieged population, Backelson, offering them regular pay. Leaflets which the Anabaptists fired into the enemy camp resulted in some 200 mercenaries going over to the Anabaptists, while others simply deserted and returned to their homes. Nor should too much be made of his infrequent visions. In an age before the subconscious had been invented and the supernatural world became void of meaning, predictions, ambitions, and commands tended to emerge as revelations. John's visions and prophecies were generally a mixture of boldness and realism, which reflected both his overweening confidence in his ability and its graft of the technique of government by terror. His approach to polygamy is a perfect illustration of his visionary strategy. He did not raise the issue at once. It was probable that his passion for Deborah, as his awareness of it, only developed after she had become a widow and he was free to talk to her. At the same time, he consolidated his position as ruler of the city, to such effect that by the 25th of May, a bare 7 weeks after assuming power, he was able to beat off a full-scale attempt to storm Munster, inflicting heavy losses on the attacking forces. Then and only then did he have the appropriate revelation. After Whitsun, he issued 12 articles to the preachers and challenged them to refute his propositions by arguments drawn from the gospel. Should they fail to prove him wrong, he would proclaim the articles to the people. These were startling. The gist of them was that a man should not be tied to one woman, but that he should take as many women to wife as he wanted. And John rested his case mainly on the examples of the Old Testament patriarchs who walked with God and who had practiced polygamy unreproved. But there was more to the argument than that. Not only was polygamy God's will, pleasing in the sight of the Lord, and should therefore be accepted, but people should increase the population. Nowadays, when the world's gravest problem is how to keep numbers from doubling every 20 years or so, this concern of population may seem strange. But the Reformation had coincided with and stimulated a revulsion against medieval celibacy. Luther's favorite text was increase and multiply. Women, he had said, are made either for marriage or for whoredom. An ex-monk himself who had set the pace in the moral upheaval of himself marrying a former nun. The Anabaptists agreed, but John proceeded to argue that if polygamy enabled more people to marry and produce more children, it should clearly be adopted. The biological rationale of this populationist approach was simple. And here is the quote: Men cannot contain themselves, and hence they can marry several women. None of their semen should be wasted, but semen is wasted if it does not produce offspring. For example, where the woman is pregnant, sterile, or is too old to have children. Thus, in order to avoid semen being wasted, any man is allowed to take another wife. Unquote. The new doctrine raised a storm of opposition among the preachers. But John was unmoved by the uproar. He summoned them to the town hall, took his gown and the New Testament, which he threw on the ground to witness to the correctness of the articles, for God the Father had revealed them to him, and he quoted all the relevant texts from the Old Testament. But to persuasion he added the stick. The counterpart of revelation is damnation of those who refuse to accept it. And John, true to type, threatened his opponents with excommunication. They would find no mercy, he thundered, at the Father's hands. The battle raged for over a week. In the end, having looked up the Bible and found that what John said was true, the preachers would run round to his point of view. They then spread it for 3 days, the standard period for an Anabaptist operation in the marketplace. The first of these sermons can be dated precisely. It was on the 23rd of July, 1534. On that day, the whole community assembled in the cathedral square, and the question of polygamy was debated for hours, says Grisbeck, a hostile witness, who notes laconically, some were for it and some were against it. In the end, people dispersed. But there was no heated debates. In fact, the mass of the citizenry seemed to have acquiesced fairly readily in the innovation proposed to them. In the community that lived by the Bible, literally interpreted, the case of polygamy had been made. That this was so is confirmed by the complete failure of a revolt on the 22nd of July, timed to capitalize on the discontent which the new measures were expected to arouse. Far from splitting the Anabaptist solidarity, the rising drew them together and was promptly and mercilessly suppressed. There is no record after this abortive revolt of a male protest against polygamy. It would be strange if it had been otherwise. The Anabaptist creed, even before the institution of marriage, had been so drastically changed, insisted on the complete subordination of women to men. They were to address their husbands as Lord, reflecting their dependence on him, analogous with man's dependence on God. The sectarians were horrified at the rise of women's status among the upper strata of society. Women, says the main exposition of Munsterite doctrine, which is found in their writing, The Restitution of Sound Christian Doctrine by the preacher Rotman, quote, have been wearing the trousers for far too long. It is time for man to assert his God-given superiority, which he was to do by introducing the, quote, lordly freedom of man, unquote, in less elevated language, the liberty to take several wives. The term God-given was no mere phrase. The Munsterites regarded polygamy as divinely revealed. Early in November, when an envoy from Prince Philip of Hesse entered the town and reproached the citizens with their views, they replied firmly that this issue had, quote, been raised by a righteous man, and they had all had to fall in behind him, though several, and indeed many of them, had been opposed to it. These had been punished by God's decree, by the sword and otherwise. They, the citizens, had the right form of marriage, and they meant to stick to it, unquote. So much for the men. But the women might logically have denounced a trend which would put them in their place. Far from it. From the outset, they played a crucial role in the Anabaptist movement in Munster and elsewhere, keyed to a higher emotional pitch. Women are seldom absent from a mystic or revivalist explosion, especially when there is an appeal to the spirit of self-sacrifice. Even before Maddies took over, They readily responded to the propaganda urging them to sell all they had and renounce the things of this world. They divested themselves of their things, gold-studded girdles and other jewelry, and were badly beaten up by their husbands when their gesture was discovered. They were forced to demand back their property, and the preachers were threatened with worse if they did not leave the women alone. The Munsterite leaders had no more fervent supporters. When the Rotman was banned from his pulpit, it was the women who agitated until he was reinstated. And the impact of his sermons was so powerful that he was accused of administering a poison, possibly a potion, which roused the women to frenzy. As the millennial fervor mounted, they began to dream dreams and see visions. The daughter of a tailor, like one possessed, preached to a large congregation of both sexes with remarkable eloquence. Some prophesied the end of the world. Others rushed through the streets, summoning the citizens to repentance. Others, during a mass demonstration, cavorted in the streets, clapping their hands, shaking their heads, looking heavenward, and crying in an awe-inspiring voice to God the Father, had appeared in the clouds with the heavenly host and a multitude of angels, and was about to come down to earth. Even the men, adds this account, were subject to illusions, but it charitably supposes they were affected by the madness of the women. When the Anabaptists gained control of the town, Brockelson delivered a sermon calling on everyone to repent, for the kingdom of Christ was at hand. The hysteria rose to new heights, though the symptoms were always much the same. Some of the women and girls stayed on after he had preached, dancing about, and cried in a loud voice, "Father, Father, Father, give, give, give." Then they leapt up, raised their hands to the sky, and clapped. Their hair undone, hung round their neck and down their back. They stared at the sun and imagined that God the Father was sitting up there in his glory. Then they danced like maenads in pairs through the streets and gazed at the sun till they were exhausted, white and deadly pale. Nor was it only a question of feverish ecstasy. The women's fanaticism was often directed toward very practical ends. In the middle of June, a 15-year-old girl decided to make her way into the camp of Bishop of Munster, who was besieging the town, and assassinated him with a poisoned shirt. But the plot miscarried, and she was executed. The emotional appeal of the sermons was enhanced by the personal fascination of the preachers, whom especially Rotman. They were most handsome figures like John, excellent orators, and all, in one way or another, involved with women. They were particularly successful in their campaign, initially launched by Luther to persuade nuns to renounce their vows. Rotman, in a sermon to a local convent, denounced the prison of virginity, in which, contrary to the dictates of nature, the nuns were detained, and urged them to do their bit in the perpetuation of the species, an occupation in which, notes the Catholic chronicler, Cressenbroich acidly, they were not at all indisposed to engage. Reader's note. So what's happening here is that Luther had this sort of ethic that he basically is advocating that a man have a wife, but he needs to have sex with a lot of these other women, perhaps many of them nuns, you see, in order to get them to bear children, but they would be illegitimate, but at least children would be born. And so this was the contrast between the two systems of belief. On the one hand, you have a very puritanical, albeit errant, Munsterite doctrine, which safeguarded and vouchsafed virginity to the nth degree. And then you have Luther, who you might regard as far more, in many ways, lenient with regard to sexual mores. And the idea of having many mistresses, perhaps, and a man having a wife, that it was considered far preferable than the idea of what the Munsterites had, at least in the nucleus of a man having multiple wives. It would be official wives of full standing. That's very interesting there. Continuing on. In short, they leapt at the opportunity to marry, since the same writer relates with horror. Their senses were inflamed by lust. A week later, the nuns were another convent abandoned the veil on the pretext of producing offspring and pressed to be allowed to endure the yoke of marriage. Nor did the enthusiasm of the women flag when polygamy was introduced. On the contrary, it was they who brought up the guns to batter in the doors of the town hall where the rebels against the new form of marriage had dug themselves in. Thereafter, the women distinguished themselves in the defense of the town, urging that the most careful guard be kept so as to avoid a surprise. When Munster was bombarded by the enemy in preparation of an attack, the women worked at night to repair the damaged walls, and during the fighting, they took their place on the walls as full participants in the battle, dropping burning wreaths of pitch on the heads of the enemy when the town was invaded on the 3rd of August, a month after polygamy had been proclaimed. Paradoxically enough, the theoretical inferiority of women in the town ran parallel to a status which in practice was in many ways uniquely high at that time. But the Anabaptist trump card in obtaining the women's support was the crude mathematical fact that in February of 1534, there were at the very least 3 women of marriageable age to 1 man, and by October the proportion may well have risen to 4 or even 5 to 1. In the chaos that followed the sectarians' assumption of power, many of the male unbelievers were driven out, but left their wives behind to look after their businesses, in expectation that they, the men, would soon be back. Conversely, streams of sympathizers swept in the New Jerusalem, sometimes husbands without wives, but more often wives whose husbands had been killed or abandoned as infidels. Given the proportion of the sexes, the pressure of polygamy was bound to be almost irresistible, quite apart from doctrinal incentives. Many a woman, as a Catholic historian of the revolt has pointed out, preferred to share a husband than have none at all. And this preference was clearly demonstrated when, at the end of the year, a number of wives were asked whether for 6 weeks they were prepared to do without their husbands who were being sent out on a dangerous mission. They were not enthusiastic at the prospect. They would hold out that long and possibly for a further 2 weeks, but if the men were not back by then, they would remarry. The male population, for its part, enthusiastically adopted the new line, especially it was maliciously observed the older members. Too enthusiastically indeed. John himself had set the example. He had once married Devara and 2 others, thus bringing his establishment up to 4. Nor was he alone in achieving this score. At a banquet in mid-October, a preacher went round the tables asking the brethren how many wives each had. Some boasted as many as 4, whereupon he replied, God praised, take precedence over me, for I have only 3. In a word, the man with the most wives was the best Christian. The result of this competitive attitude was, it is alleged, a free-for-all pursuit of marriageable women and girls. The men, say Grespic, stormed through the whole town and invaded every house where there was a woman, girl, or maid, 4 or even 6 men in succession, each trying to outbid the other in his numbers of wives. But to restore a semblance of decorum, the leaders soon intervened. The men were urged to invite their prospective wives to their house or to visit them alone. If the woman's spirit did not testify, the standard Anabaptist phrase, in her suitor's favor, or if she was already committed, she would desist. If, on the contrary, his proposal was accepted, the couple should, for the regulation of 3 days, pray to God that they should live in a godly way, which meant that they should abstain from intercourse when the woman was menstruating or pregnant. The only men who did not join the marriage rush were the non-Anabaptists, who were reluctant in principle to take a second wife. However, even they, if unmarried, or if their wife had fled the town, could not avoid complying with the order to marry and took at least 1 wife. The same problem arose for the women. All unmarried females were under strong moral pressure to take a husband, and indeed, a number of marriages in those early days were clearly contracted under duress. We are assured by Grespic with a smirk that where the Christian sister's spirit would not testify, the Christian brother's spirit did. To the effect that it wanted her, and if she persisted in her refusal to take him, and had nobody else in the offing, she was hauled before the preachers and forced to give in. Reader's note, that sounds a little bit like a shotgun marriage of a sort, doesn't it? The situation was particularly hard for non-sectarian women. They tried to avoid polygamy by finding an unmarried man, but there can hardly have been many bachelors in the market. And as in the case of the men, those whose spouse had fled were regarded as single and had therefore to remarry and commit bigamy. These excesses were to some extent remedied toward the end of the year in a decree of John's, which confirmed the death penalty for such crimes as adultery, dated the 2nd of January, 1535, ruled that force should on no account be used to contract marriage. The blame was cunningly shifted to a group of preachers who had left the city on a mission in mid-October and were caught and promptly executed. These women, who had married against their will, were allowed to register at the town hall and their marriages were dissolved. Some 200 women took advantage of the concession out of about 2,000 who had contracted marriages after the 23rd of July. But Grespek maintains that many others would have applied, but for the fear that it was all a trap. In fact, according to the same source, the divorced women went off with the curses of the preachers ringing in their ears. Divorce was, however, far from being a general practice. It was granted when it could be shown that compulsion had been used, and on two other grounds: impotency on the part of the man and the absence of Anabaptist conviction on the part of one of either husband or wife. All three grounds, it should be observed, have close parallels in Catholic canon law as regards annulment. Reader's note, isn't that fascinating? And you look at these reasons for, and remember that the Catholics had the idea of annulment rather than strict divorce, which basically was the idea that, let's say, if a couple got together and they found themselves grossly incompatible, either in belief, if the belief was asymmetrical, that they were not of the same belief, or if the man was impotent, or if it says here, let's see, some of these, granted, it could be shown that compulsion. In other words, if she had been sort of railroaded into this marriage, okay, that would be a reason. And then impotency on the part of the man. And then also, if you have such a diverse and different belief system between the husband and wife, annulment was allowed in Catholic canon law. Now, that is really fascinating, interesting there. It's certainly not a commentary on what the Apostle Paul would do, and I think perhaps the Apostle Paul had other solutions if you read the New Testament. Continuing on. Another source, Fabrics, it looks like Fabricius, probably has impetus in mind when referred to the public hearing of marital cases in the marketplace when the decisions were given by John from his throne. The wife, he writes, complained about the man and the man about the wife and brought up details that no Christian dare repeat. Married couples were divorced. They had lived together for 20 or 30 years. Wow. The divorcees included a small group which had particularly good reason for wishing to be freed. These were girls of 11 to 14 years of age, some 18 in all, who had been railroaded into marriage even before puberty. It is a ghastly story. They were, we are told crudely, too small, and the consequences of marriage was disastrous. They had to be handed over to a woman doctor for treatment. She managed to cure most of them, as many as 15, and these, like the others, married by force, registered at the town hall and were given a divorce. The remainder, presumably 3 in number, died. Reader's note, monstrous crimes indeed. And this is whereby we get a lot of the laws that have been passed. You see, a lot of this situation in the Middle Ages impacts the precedent of legal law, legal code, and it has to do with marriageable age. The minimum marriageable age, which in the United States, this has been carried on, and much of this has formulated that legal code. This and many other circumstances, I'm sure, where I think in some states still allowed with a parent's consent, a 16-year-old may marry, but in most cases it's 18 at minimum, in the West and the United States and so on. Continuing on, this atrocious episode is in part the result of a defective understanding of biology and in part of the sectarians' obsession with population. It was ruled, says one of the preachers, that as it had been ascertained that girls could become pregnant before puberty, permission should be given for them to marry. And there is another somewhat obscure testimony by, this is a name here, Knipper Dolink, which runs, when the trees no longer blossom in the old woman, there was no hope of fruit. But among the young girls, there was hope if they desired it. They should therefore be allowed sexual relations, which means literally be used for sexual relations. Knipperdolink added that the doctrine was promulgated by a preacher, probably a lame prophet, called, looks like Dusenshore, jointly with John. It is known that one of the victims, Clara Knipperdolink, The leader's daughter was one of John's wives. She was treated by the woman doctor like the others and cured, but refused to return to her husband, probably after such a monstrous endeavor. John himself strenuously denied the force had been used. Only when the girls desired or at least consented were they married. And whenever he caught anyone guilty of force, the offender was punished. How was it possible for anyone to talk seriously about an 11-year-old girl agreeing to marriage? To marriage is not clear to a modern reader. As I said, sounds monstrous, and it was monstrous. It was monstrous. But it is as well not to judge such situations, however repulsive, solely by modern standards. The age for marrying was far lower in the 16th century than nowadays. Now, that's an interesting little note there, isn't it? That the author, and that may be true. And that may be true. Maybe there were different conditions, eating conditions, different food, different kinds of, girls were getting out working much quicker. Maybe their puberty came on quicker. I don't, I don't know. Very complex situation to consider. The current Catholic ruling was that boys were fit for marriage at 14 and girls at 12, but they were capable of copulation early. Marriage should even then be permitted. In Protestant England, a writer quotes the forward virgins of our age as regarding 14 as the best age for marriage, if 13 be not better than that. And the importance attached to women's wishes was slight. Luther regarded the death of women in childbed with indifference. What harm is there in that? He is reported to have asked. Childbearing is what they are for. Wow. I'm sure the feminists would have a field day with Luther today, wouldn't they? If some of the girls paid for the new system with their lives, so did some of the original first wives. When polygamy was introduced, it bore hard on them, and there were clearly serious trouble, at least to start with. One Anabaptist talks of difficulties caused by carnal wives, those, that is, who objected to another woman sharing their husband's affection. But he maintains that by mid-October, the tension had subsided and the new regime had been accepted. Grespick, as usual, gives a different picture. The forced cohabitation of different women under the same roof, he relates, gave rise to constant dissension. Hell was let loose. There was fierce resentment in the town among the women, where 2 or 3 of them lived together and shared a husband. There was no end to the abuse and bickering among them, for their first wife always wished to be closest to her husband, and so did the new wives. Thus, they could not get along together, and there was never any peace. Complaints streamed in every day to the prophets and the preachers and the 12 elders. At first, the authorities put the refractory wives in prison, but in vain. Then Rotman brandished the much graver threat of the sword, which cowed them for a time. Gresbeck then conjures up a vision of a reign of terror with heads falling right and left. There is no warrant for such a somber view. At most, there are records of 6 executions, of which one is a special case, which will be dealt with later. Of these, 3 are gruesome enough, but have no obvious connection with polygamy, although they all occur in the critical period when the new form of marriage had just been introduced. They follow logically from the iron moral code of the sectarians. One woman was executed late in September because she had repeatedly refused her husband intercourse and had been guilty of what in Anabaptist eyes was a horrendous blasphemy. "Oh, Father," she had cried, "if you have the power, let me never again ascend this marriage bed alive." The following day, another woman was dispatched because she had 2 husbands. Polygamy was a strict one-way matter for the sectarians. And another woman was beheaded in the same month because she had insulted a preacher, alleging that he had built his doctrines on sand. She crowned her offense by spitting in his face. Only the 4th case, which came up early in October, fits in with Grespick's account. A woman had protested strongly against her husband taking another wife. She was summoned to the tribunal, but as she was pregnant, the sentence of death was to be executed only after the birth of her child. In a similar case, a woman accused her husband of living carnally with his other wives, that is, of not abstaining when they were pregnant or menstruating. She too was given a reprieve because pregnant, but was ultimately pardoned since she begged her husband's forgiveness. The only other instance of a wife being executed for having protested at the presence of rivals occurs the following May, when a husband's refusal to send away a younger wife led his first wife to seize a chair and threaten to split it on his skull if he persisted in his conduct. She was promptly beheaded. But these were the extreme manifestations of protest. What went on in the average household is difficult to fathom, and it should be remembered that the whole experiment lasted only about 11 months. However, there is no evidence of any serious opposition to polygamy on the part of the first wives. Indeed, there is an assertion by an Anabaptist preacher that, quote, the wives were such good friends with their husbands that they went out and got wives for them like Sarah for Abraham or Jacob, unquote, which may well have been true, though Gresbeck comments on it as being the height of mental cruelty. Nor should it be forgotten that the women, i.e., the first wives, since polygamy had not yet got underway, helped to crush the revolt of the 29th of July against the new institution. As to the second wives, they had at least a definite gain from polygamy in the form of husband, even if shared, which they would probably not have had otherwise. And there is no known case of one of their number having been arrested for protesting against the system. However, much depended on the woman's attitude of the regime as a whole, and indeed, as Gresbeck confirms, attitudes for and against polygamy ran closely parallel with the degree of sympathy for the sectarian regime. Some women thought the preachers were knaves, and some that they were carrying out God's will. And the former group, consistently enough, criticized polygamy on the ground that it was not right for a man to have 5 or 6 wives, and that he ought to be content with one, for many piglets make the gruel thin. What is certain is that the women, whatever their marital status, gave the men strong backing in the defense of the town. Had there been any extensive opposition to the new form of marriage, it is clear that this would have been reported, and almost equally certain that it would have been undermined resistance to the besieging forces. In fact, the only generalized opposition recorded is on the part of the older women. They too were obliged to take a protector, quote unquote, that they were allowed to choose him. He was to be responsible for their upkeep so that they would lack for nothing. They were to be as well looked after as the rich. The protectors also had to keep an eye on the old lady's orthodoxy, and if they gave signs of deviating from the true beliefs, the protectors were to see that they were brought before the prophets and preachers and forced to mend their ways. Some women, as can be well imagined, took the whole affair as a joke. They were obliged, like all wives, to call their protectors Lord, and this pompous title was work for a laugh for all it was worth. Have you seen my Lord? Gresbeck represents them as asking each other ironically. And in the same subversive spirit, they would inquire what their friend's spirit testified. These would seem to be, for the most part, the old conservative elements who had little sympathy for the new radical ideas, but they must have been allowed a considerable margin of freedom and to have made their views felt. For after some time, the authorities abolished the deferential form of address of women to men and reverted to the old practice. All this suggests a rather less terror-laden atmosphere than most of the surviving accounts. But there was another element which helped to ensure feminine support for the regime, and hence, at the last, their toleration of polygamy. This was the increasing color, pomp, and drama which John imparted to his rule. The change started after the rout of an attack by the enemy at the end of August. Had he taken advantage of their demoralization, he might have dominated northwest Germany, joining forces with the strong Anabaptist factions in the region and in Holland. Instead, he allowed himself to be carried away by millennialist fantasies, partly under the influence of his evil genius, the prophet Dusenschur, who in September had John proclaimed king of the realm of Munster. The new monarch claimed power not only over the few square miles covered by the town, but over all the nations of the earth. The preachers expounded to the elated populace of the doctrine that the Messiah, this is quote, Messiah foretold by the prophets in the Old Testament was none other than Bacchusson, unquote. He did everything possible to underline the significance of his accession. Although, notes Cohn, money had no function in Munster, a new purely ornamental coinage was created with inscriptions such as, the Word has become flesh and dwells in us, and one king over all, one God, one faith, one baptism. A disturbing anticipation of a similar slogan of a latter-day German dictator, unquote. Very interesting. Reader's note, very interesting. They even made their own money. Wow, they were really trying to get self-contained, weren't they? A lot of interesting facts in here. If you could take the things that, really, I mean, from my perspective, if you can take the good and kick out the bad, if you can create an ecclesiastical court which stomps out these excesses, these crimes, He really would have to have quite a detailed legal code put in place, or at least an ecclesiastical code put in place, in order to manage. But it appears here that the management of such was done so abysmally. And there were a confluence of events too. There were a lot of enemies on the outside and such, kind of conditions that probably would not, one might not come upon today. And that is in no way is that is not my approval of what we're reading here. As many of the listeners would be equally aghast at some of the uh, kinds of events that occurred. But continuing on, the new king dressed in magnificent robes. Whenever he appeared in public, he was accompanied by his suite, also splendidly dressed. In the marketplace, a throne was erected, draped with cloth of gold and strewn with purple cushions. It towered over the surrounding benches, heralded by a fanfare. John would arrive on horseback, wearing his crown and carrying his scepter. The royal bodyguard accompanied and protected the whole procession. On either side of the throne stood a page, one holding a copy of the Old Testament to show that the king was successor of David, and the other holding a naked sword. And he signed his decrees as John the Just, king in the new temple, servant of the all highest and holy God. It must all have been a magnificent and exciting show, heightened by impassioned sermons, mystic prophecies, and on a less exalted plane, banquets, lavish theatrical performances, and sensual dances. The women loved it. Devara, in particular, must have reveled in these ploys. She was proclaimed queen, had her suite, and held court like her husband. The other wives, who ultimately amounted to 15, were forced to obey her. By making an opening in his palace in the cathedral square, John was able to transform the neighboring houses into the women's quarters. His wives lived in almost as great splendor as himself. They dressed in silk and velvet and had so many ornaments, jewels, and rings that his Westphalian harem could vie with that of an emperor. Keeping order must have been almost as difficult as ruling town. To people his palace, John had chosen the most ravishing beauties from all classes, and none of them over 20. We are given a titillating glimpse of his domestic arrangements from Kersbroik. The tale loses nothing in the telling except possible accuracy. To avoid quarrels, he writes, John worked out an ingenious system. He fashioned a table in which he wrote the queen's names in order of precedence, and he had a hole bored in front of each name to hold a stick. The queen who found the stick thus inserted in front of her at dinner knew that she had been chosen to spend the night with the king, but she was allowed to pass on the honor to a fellow queen if she was indisposed. Before retiring, the favorite was subjected to an elaborate toilet. She was given a bath, had fragrant essences poured over her, and was clad in linen or purple. Her fingers were stiff with rings. She was adorned with bejeweled necklaces. Gold was woven into her hair, and her brows girt with green and fragrant garlands. Her lap was covered by a silken garment. Her breast shone through a transparent veil. In a word, everything that could turn the senses was devised by the cunning old women in charge of the favorite's toilet. Reader's note: the term toilet here would be kind of like the makeup center. When women get themselves together and want to look nice for the day, that entire area is sort of summed up in an Old English term, toilet. Continuing on, for all the sensual delights, John's marriages were none too prolific. His wives had 2 children, both daughters. They were born by his first 2 wives, Nipperdolink's maid and Devara, but both were begotten by their former husbands. A judgment of God, asserts Kersbroik. But he forgets that John married all but these and another 2 girls after the beginning of November, and hence, with the exception of these other 2, could not possibly have had any children by the time his regime ended, which was less than 9 months after. The king was insanely proud of Devara's daughter, who was called, looks like newborn, signifying the mystic rebirth of the soul when cleansed of this world's sins. And he declared that never had such a child been born since Christ had appeared on the earth. The pomp and fervor surrounding the regime could not, however, conceal its inherent weakness. By January 1535, the town was sealed off from the outside and provisions cut off. By April, famine was raging, and every animal, down to the rats, cats, and hedgehogs had been killed and eaten. In May, the women were cast out, including several of the queens, and left to starve in the no man's land between the opposing forces, or, if lucky, to be taken by the besiegers as concubines. However, John still kept a firm grip on his subjects, executing deserters with his own hands if caught, and he was equally ferocious toward women who rebelled or made off without his permission. The only victim known to us from this critical period is a queen named Wanshurs. She was a woman of fierce independence. She had fled from one husband and been brought back to him, but outlived him. She had been married to another, but obtained a divorce about December 1534, since she maintained she had accepted under duress. Thus liberated, she boasted to her father that the man was not born who could get the better of her. The king, on learning of this provocative remark, promptly had her sent to prison. 3 days later, she was summoned to his presence, and, as was of noble features, the king was so taken by her that he offered to marry her if she would prove obedient. The girl is said to have replied, possibly out of fear, but certainly out of character, quote, "If your maidservant, O illustrious king, could find favor in my king's eyes to wash the feet of all the king's wives, or to do even more menial tasks, my king would find his maidservant more than ready to perform this or any other service," unquote. The king was even more impressed by this unexpected humility, and, far from making her his maidservant, added her to the list of his queens. As starvation tightened his hold, she is said to have been disgusted at the indulgence and luxury of the court at the time when the people were starving. She sent the king back his rings and jewels and begged to be allowed to leave the city. Another version has it that she planned to slip out in secret and that her intention was reported to the king. Whatever the truth, she was dragged to the marketplace and forced to kneel. In the presence of the rest of the harem, John cut off her head with his own hands, kicked over the corpse and denounced the dead woman as a whore, and loaded the body on a cart, whereupon the other wives struck up the hymn, "Glory to God in the highest." The gruesome scene was followed by a dance at which John bid everyone make merry, since they had entered the new temple. Reader's note. Absolutely monstrous, monstrous. Actually, what caught me is how in the world could he cut off a head just with his hands? I don't know. He must have had very strong hands, especially without a blade. That just a sort of a side note there, but the gruesomeness of it is undeniable. Continuing on. It was in this macabre atmosphere of forced gaiety that the kingdom of the saints collapsed. In the bloody night of 24th of June, 1535, the attackers, guided by the same Grespic, who was later to compose an account of the siege and who had escaped from Munster a month before, forced an entry at the weakest point in the defenses and rapidly overpowered and massacred the defenders. The 300 surviving men surrendered on promise of a safe conduct and returned home, only to be liquidated one by another shortly after. The women were spared, except those who had actively taken part in the Anabaptist movement or who refused to recant. Deborah was one of these. She was captured, stuck to her faith, and was promptly beheaded. John himself and the other leaders were kept alive for torture and interrogation. For some time, he was, quote, led about on a chain and exhibited like a performing bear. When he was asked in the presence of a large crowd if he was the man who had taken so many wives, he replied with the shaft of his old whip that he had not taken any wives, Weber, which originally means women, but maidens who he had made women of. Interesting there. That little bit of a... I have the idea of a different word to describe the situation. Weber, which originally means woman. These were his women, he says. That he did not acknowledge they were his wives, but that these were his women. He was twice interrogated in January 1536, apart from judicial interrogation under torture by 2 Lutheran clerics. He persisted in his defense of polygamy, though he admitted that it was an innovation and hardly be tolerated. But it had been allowed by the patriarchs in the Old Testament. Why, therefore, should it not be allowed to us? And as in the old days, he always hit on the appropriate text from the Bible. There's gospel for you, he concluded triumphantly. The 2 Lutherans fell back on the argument that marriage was a matter for the secular authorities who represented God's authority on earth. Reader's note here. Remember that the Lutherans were incorrect in this because remember that Yeshua said very clearly with regard, if it so be that it was a matter for the secular authorities, then why did John the Baptist rebuke Herod for taking his brother's wife? If it so be that the secular authorities are the sole arbiter of marriage, and if it so be that the secular authorities are the sole arbiter of marriage, then we should all gaily, I use that term very poignantly, accept LGBTQ marriage. Should we not? Should we not? And of course, it's interesting that the Lutherans were dead wrong about this, but they said so out of fear, probably because the Catholics had an iron hold over the nation. Continuing on. Polygamy was now forbidden, and John could hardly take it upon himself to introduce a new doctrine. John stuck to his patriarchal guns. In the end, beat off his interrogators with a bluntly practical argument which had a distinct Lutheran ring. Better several wives than several whores. And when told that whoremongery was wrong, but polygamy not therefore necessarily right, John fired his final shot. Let God be judge between us. At the second interview, he showed signs of recanting. He admitted having rebelled against the duly constituted authorities, but tried to put the blame for this on the looks like Dusenshore, long conveniently out of the way. And he promised to try and convert his followers to infant baptism if his life was spared. On polygamy, he went so far as to agree that it could only be introduced if the authorities approved it, and that he had acted, precipitatedly. Had he known what he now knew, he would have followed a more sagacious course. But here again, he protested that he had been driven on by Dusenshore. To the end, he insisted that he had offended against man, but never against God. Very interesting confession there, isn't it? And so he sort of in other words, he had a provocateur that he laid the blame upon. This is his argument, of course. And so the idea that he should have acted more sagaciously, and I think that's how you pronounce that, but essentially what he's saying is he could have curbed the excesses. He would have been more wise, he is saying. And I must I do somewhat sympathize with the man, though he allowed monstrous acts to occur. Because I got to tell you, when you're trying to manage what he was attempting to manage, it requires a very great and wise and discerning man. I mean, I got to tell you, it takes a lot. It takes a lot to be able to manage all of that in a right way. It really does. And the problem is, and you have all of these upstarts that come along and they manage abysmally in many respects. Continuing on. He was tied to a stake with Kniperdulik and another rebel leader and tortured to death with red-hot tongs amidst the rejoicing and applause of the Catholic audience, as Lutheran eyewitnesses recorded uneasily. John endured his ordeal with heroic fortitude, not a sound, not a movement. After his death, his body and those of the two others were suspended from a church tower in the middle of the town in cages which are still to be seen today. The former regime was restored under the Catholic Prince Bishop, and the town remained Catholic ever afterwards. Thus ended a unique attempt to alter the institution of monogamous marriage. Its significance is best gauged by the reaction it aroused. Detmer, the one so-called historian to make a particular study of the question, is short on historical quotations and rich in outbursts of moral indignation. Quote, the too Christian Germanic feeling, unquote, he cries, quote, revolts at the mere thought of such a state of affairs, unquote. And now reader's note on this. And in particular, when he probably, at least I'm surmising, that revolts upon this, he is perhaps revolting, yes, about the idea that polygamy is that they claim was righteous, but that he doesn't. But you know what? I think what he revolted about mostly is the extreme excesses, the extreme abysmal conduct, the extreme, the deplorable manner in which it was conducted. This is what added fuel to the fire, so to speak. And this is just my analysis as the reader. Continuing on. The learned Van Ronkel talks in much the same vein about the sectarians as sapping the moral basis of human society, which had its deepest roots in the German people. And this is from the Encyclopedia Britannica. And this is a 1962 version of the Encyclopedia Britannica under Anabaptist. Writes that John, quote, himself took 4 wives, one of whom he beheaded with his own hand in the marketplace in a fit of frenzy. As a natural consequence, Munster was for 12 months the scene of unbridled profligacy, in which the only statement with which I can agree is that polygamy in the city lasted 12 months. Even such a careful historian as Norman Kahn, misled by rough analogies with sexual promiscuous Christian sex, takes a stern line when he comes to polygamy. In the end, divorce had to be permitted, and this in turn changed polygamy into something not very different from free love. The religious ceremony of marriage had dispensed with. The marriages were contracted and dissolved with great facility. Even if much of the hostile account which we possess is discounted as exaggerations, it seems certain that norms of sexual behavior in the kingdom of the saints traversed the whole arc from rigorous Puritanism to sheer promiscuity. I believe this is a quote from Norman Cohn. And it's very difficult not to agree with his assessment after reading the accounts. I mean, and I'm sure that most reasoned people out there will think, well, it sounds pretty accurate to me. Continuing on, the horror felt by modern historians goes back in large part to a similar reaction visible in all the contemporary accounts other than those by the Anabaptists themselves. Beck ascribes the adoption of polygamy to the fact that the preachers deceived the poor, ignorant mob and won it over because it was inflamed by lasciviousness. Cairncross goes one better. According to him, John introduced polygamy because he was caught one evening stealing into the bedroom of Knipperdlink's maid and feared exposure. Life under the Munsterite regime was one vast orgy. After the suppression of the revolt in the 20th of July, he writes, all honorableness, chastity, restraint, and shame were cast aside. People all burned with unbridled lust, wallowed in swinish excesses, and were so inflamed by unbounded desire that they knew no limits to their unnatural love. Cairncross even swallows the most absurd slanders against the sectarians. He has a particularly vivid account of John's predecessor, Matty's, preaching in Knipperdlink's house, putting out the candles when he came to the text, increase and multiply, and giving the signal for an outburst of license. What shameful deeds were committed that night, with every feeling of modesty discarded, may be gathered from the fact that the prophet himself was caught in the closet contact with a girl. This kind of ceremony, the writer solemnly asserts, was known as baptism by fire. In reporting these tales, Cairncross was merely reproducing the slanders of the day. Such accusations were indignantly denied by the sectarians. Both before and after the introduction of polygamy, they issued a stream of pamphlets rejecting the charges of, for example, practicing free love and community of wives. They were also accused of incest, but Cairncross's evidence shows clearly that they were merely guilty of disregarding the strict medieval interdicts and not of incest as it is generally understood today between children and parents or between brother and sister. The sentence in question reads, no account was taken in contracted marriage of the relation between brothers and sisters-in-law or between cousins. This development has an interesting parallel in polygamy as practiced 4 centuries later by the Mormons. And it is logical enough when the account is taken of the more outward-looking attitude of the larger polygamous groups, as opposed to the tendency of the monogamous pair to take up a more defensive stance in its relations with the rest of the world. Unfortunately, the bias and distortions coloring the statements of the age have, in most cases, been uncritically swallowed by modern writers, even though they were long ago refuted by reputable German scholars in the 19th century. Reader's note, very critical thing to understand, that perhaps much of the excesses were greatly disputed by reputable German scholars. What we read here, could very well be the worst, most salacious tale that you could possibly imagine. And it was used by various forces to gin up anger and disgust, where in reality, it's very likely that some of these excesses were not in fact present, but in fact the opposite, at least according to these reputable German scholars. Continuing on. These historians have in particular demonstrated the lack of reliability of the two main chroniclers of the Anabaptist regime, Gressbeck and Cairncross. The former was depended for what it saw if we disregard the time sequence and in many other things, such as the leaders' consultations and plans, their relations with each other, the inside of John's court, the peculiar theories of the sect, etc. He is imperfectly informed and was outside the inner circle. He belonged to the mass. Cairncross is even more unreliable. As a child, he was a witness of the Munster regime up to February 1534, until just before the beginning of the siege, and he wrote his account some 20 years or after. Both writers are blatantly biased, hostile to the Anabaptists, and often either exaggerated or inaccurate. Thus, Gressbeck says that at the banquet in mid-October, the king suddenly had a vision and sent for a mercenary who had been taken prisoner. He thereupon executed him in a fit of frenzy. a version accepted by Cohn. But Fabricius, who visited the town as Lutheran envoy, gives a much fuller and better informed account. He reports that the prisoner was brought into the banqueting hall by the Anabaptists themselves and gives plenty to drink. The king caught sight of him and asked him what his beliefs were. He replied that he cared only for women and wine. He was then executed. This is merely one of many examples showing the need to scrutinize every piece of evidence very carefully before accepting it. Reader's note here. Much of what I get from this also is such that you see how a tale is told, and it can be slanted a certain way. It can leave out certain facts. And I got to say, this is why the Apostle Paul says women ought not to go around tale bearing. Well, men tale bear too, wrongly, according to Scripture, against Scripture. And so this is why even today we have to be very careful. The Bible tells us that by 2 or 3 witnesses every matter shall be established. Well, when you have such an incredible event like this occur, of course there's going to be rascals that are going to come out, and through their own motivations as such, they're going to recount details on things that are not wholly accurate. It's not the whole picture. It's a partial picture, which leads the readers or listeners to at least come to a very, I won't say a perfectly inaccurate, but or grossly inaccurate, but in many ways inaccurate. They won't get the full story. Continuing on. The statements of the Anabaptists themselves have mostly either been destroyed or are gathering dust in obscure libraries. The result is that we have to depend largely on the writings of their bitter enemies for material to reconstruct their history. It is rather as if the history of the Chinese Cultural Revolution was entrusted to an extremely conservative Catholic theologian. In fact, Munster, under Anabaptist rule, far from being the scene of wild orgies, was throughout a center of extreme austere morality. Look at that. I'm going to read it again. This is from a Catholic theologian. In fact, Munster, under Anabaptist rule, far from being the scene of wild orgies, was throughout a center of extremely austere morality. Look at that. Its only crime in the sexual field by Orthodox standards was to have introduced polygamy, and a highly Puritan type at that. Very interesting. So you have these different accounts. Who knows what really went on? And it's interesting that Catholic theologian would basically give the opposite of what these others. The alleged licentiousness would have been completely at variance with the rigid discipline imposed on the town by its commander. Quote, everyone, notes Kahn, was allotted an essential task as artisan or in maintenance or repair of the fortifications. The guards on the walls were regularly inspected by the elders day and night. When some mercenaries who had come over from the besieging forces got drunk and created a disturbance in a tavern, they were shot. It should be remembered that the women formed an integral part of the defense. The discipline, adds Kahn, was one in Maine, a personal achievement of Bockelson, who must have been a very competent organizer. Without this discipline, the town could not conceivably have sustained the siege. It was no commonplace personality that could induce a little town of some 15,000 inhabitants, of whom only 1,500 were capable of bearing arms, to hold out against a coalition of principalities and through appalling hardships for over a year. Indeed, Kahn admits that sexual behavior was at first regulated strictly and talks of a severely puritanical morality. And this morality is incorporated in a series of articles promulgated by John himself before the introduction of polygamy in July of 1534. These made adultery and fornication offenses punishable by death. Fornication, including intercourse with one's wife during pregnancy and menstruation. The husband was to be absolute master in the home. These rules continued to be observed after the 23rd of July. John, for example, insisted that he had never had intercourse with Deborah, who was pregnant by Matthias when she married him, until after her child was born. The other Anabaptist leaders made similar claims, and the word is accepted by such a serious scholar as Rockwell. Even the hostile Gresbeck admits that, to start with, the sectarians tried to live in a godly way with the women. Interesting. Kahn thinks, as we have seen, that there was a subsequent degeneration because in the end, divorce had to be permitted, and this in turn changed polygamy into something not very different from free love. This is quite untenable. Divorce, in fact, annulment was permitted only on 3 grounds, all broadly speaking admitted by canon law, to women if it could be shown that they were forced to marry, or if the husband was impotent, or if the husband was an unbeliever. Men were not allowed divorce except on the last of these grounds. If his first wife was sterile, this was an additional reason for taking a second one. Divorce, moreover, meant that no woman could be married to two men simultaneously. Indeed, this was punishable by death. Gresbeck asserts that the Anabaptists subsequently strayed from their principles, but why? Because women they had determined had been fruitful or not. It is clear from the context that he is thinking of the episode of the young girls who, since they had not reached puberty, could not, in fact, be fruitful and were therefore, in his view, being used by the Munsterites to satisfy their bestial desires. In reality, this practice, atrocious as it was based on the absurd idea that the girls could bear children, so that what in effect happened was that these wretched creatures were sacrificed to the obsession of the sectarians for population and their misconception of biological laws. But the sexual code continued to be observed. Not only was polygamy as practiced in Munster compatible with that code and that obsession, but in the main it flowed from them. If men were not allowed intercourse when women were pregnant or menstruating, their semen ran to waste. Therefore, a man should take another wife or wives. Thus, purity was maintained, and at the same time, the population increased. Nor was it even a question in theory, at least for the men satisfying their sexual drive. The Anabaptists claimed, on the contrary, that they were eliminating lust and thus returned to the state of sinlessness obtained before the fall. Not for nothing is the main doctrinal writing of the Munsterites by Rotman called, quote, the Restitution, for its subject is precisely the restitution of all things to the original purity of Eden before corruption entered the world. The aim of marriage, he wrote, is to beget children who will praise God for all eternity. Husband and wife married to live according to God's love in order to beget children, and for no other reason. Only for this purpose did God create man and woman and unite them. This document is the first known apology for polygamy in Europe. It is this conception of a moral paradise that Fabricius, the Lutheran envoy to the city, had in mind when he wrote, quote, everything was free under them. They could no longer sin, unquote. Very interesting. When, therefore, such constant emphasis was laid on the need to increase the population, John and his colleagues were not simply following Luther's anti-celibacy line, but, the key words, the principle that the world should be increased for God wanted to set up a new world with his people, unquote. In a word, as explained at the beginning of this chapter, the most rapid increase in the number of children conceived without sin in the New Jerusalem was an integral part of the Anabaptist millennial beliefs. Mattie's master Hoffman predicted that the advent of the New Jerusalem would be hastened if the elect could conceive without sin in covenantal purity, as before the fall. The 144,000, quote unquote, who were to be sealed according to one of the favorite texts of the millennialist, Revelation chapter 7, verse 4. And Rotman, in a sermon in Munster Cathedral, proclaimed the saints should multiply as the sands of the sea, quote unquote. It was this same doctrine that surfaced in July when John proclaimed polygamy, mainly as a means, doctrinally speaking, of increasing the number of those who were to be sealed. Polygamy, far from being a change designed to provide an outlet for overvigorous males, can only be understood from within the visionary mystic outlook of Old Testament literalism, and, if we are to go further in history, the asceticism of the early fathers such as Jerome, who thought it was a mortal sin to love one's wife, and Augustine, who elaborated an intriguing theory of lustless sex in Eden, that, in practice, desire, consciously or unconsciously, but mostly unconsciously, was lurking underneath all these perfectionist theories as certain as can be. But as it is impossible to sound the heart of man or even look into the bedrooms of the past, the precise form or extent of this influence cannot be determined. What is not permissible is to attribute a complex psychological process and sincerely held religious views to a deliberate attempt to provide more sex for the male. I'm going to read that again because this is really the crux of an analysis of the author here. But as it is impossible to sound the heart of man or even to look into the bedrooms of the past, the precise form or extent of this influence cannot be determined. What is not permissible is to attribute a complex psychological process and sincerely held religious views to a deliberate attempt to provide more sex for the male, which, reader's note, I think is the greatest objection that many liberal females have against the institution, and perhaps many in the church as well, since many in the church are liberal females too. We're going to finish this up now, this chapter. Although it had been practiced for less than a year, Puritan polygamy was not extinguished under the ash of the ruined city. The influence of the Munsterites' ideas were profound. There are traces of them in the writings of Paracelsus, the mysterious eclectic doctor. If there is such a surplus of women, he writes, let it be taken care of by marriage, so that the intentions of God's commandments be heeded. If this cannot be achieved by giving each man one wife, he should have two, or whatever number may be required to take care of the surplus. More directly, John's mantle fell on John of Battenberg, the illegitimate son of a noble Dutch house who practiced polygamy secretly in the Netherlands. He was arrested in 1537 and executed soon after. Another colorful polygamist is David Joris, also Dutch. To escape persecution, he fled to Basel in Switzerland, where he lived under a false name with a bigamous wife. Only after his death in 1559 were his heresies discovered, and his body is exhumed and burned by the hangman together with his writings. Wow, they had quite a hatred even after death, didn't they? That's kind of an interesting little tidbit there, isn't it? Finishing up here, finally in 1567, a cobbler named Jan Williamson set up a new community of the saints in Westphalia, which practiced polygamy. He himself had 21 wives. By way of justifying their practice, the community secretly reprinted Rotman's classic, quote, The Restitution. Williamson, too, was caught and burned in 1580. But despite unremitting repression, the ashes of the Munsterite heresy continued to smolder. They were to be rekindled in the following century. And that is the end of this section of reading for today, my friends. I hope you enjoyed. And there's a lot here, I think, to learn. And so, until next time, with all of that, I shall bid you shalom, shalom.